ShoeOnHead's partner. You the man whore? No, I won't be using his proper name, but I will be trying to use his proper pronouns, which I assume is he, him, altar boy, choir boy, some things like that. So it seems that he is hyping up something he calls post-liberalism. Instead of me actually trying to go through this sort of backwards, sort of confusing thing, let him give you a sample of how he describes it.
What is post-liberalism? In 2018, Patrick Deneen advanced a searing indictment of our political order in his aptly named Why Liberalism Failed. In his critique of liberalism, not of liberalism in the colloquial sense of the American left or the Democratic Party, but rather of the Enlightenment era's classical philosophical liberalism, Deneen writes, "Liberalism has failed, not because it fell short, but because it was true to itself. It has failed because it has succeeded." In other words, our order's philosophical underpinnings, the political philosophy largely embraced by America's founders and subscribed to, either knowingly or unknowingly, by almost every American today, has fulfilled its promises. It has achieved its purported ends. It has triumphed. And we are all worse for it.
Because of the introduction to the video, I figured I would look into this Dean guy that was brought up in the video, My Politics in a Nutshell, Post-Liberalism. So I looked up why liberalism failed, at least on YouTube. There's a lot of stuff out there, but really no one actually critiquing it or going over it critically. But there is at least a brief mention of it in a podcast talking about Dean's newest book, Regime Change, that mirrors my criticism of ShoeOnHead's partner's lackluster video and article about post-liberalism.
That right liberals, by which he means all conservatives and all libertarians who don't, well, all libertarians and all conservatives who don't agree with him, are right liberals, basically have the same ideological, teleological, philosophical purpose, aim, mission as left-wing progressive elites. And the idea that, like, William F. Buckley and James Burnham and Michael Novak and Father Newhouse and all of those guys, Irving Kristol, we're all hand in hand part of a popular front of a unified monolithic elite with a bunch of left-wing progressives is just incredibly stupid. I mean, I don't, it's a dumb claim. It's unsupportable. And he makes really no attempt to support it in the chapter where he deals with the elite. He basically just focuses on the left because you can't make the case that he wants to just assert.
There really isn't much here for people to really cover in his nutshell video or why he left liberalism. And since I really want to get into what he can actually put out there that can sort of back up any claims he made in those two videos, I thought I would do a brief coverage of his video, What is Liberal Limitphobia? That's a new one to me. All the phobias going around, Limitphobia seems a little odd, but let's get started.
But what is freedom, really? Most people, if you were to ask them what freedom is, will tell you that it's the ability to do whatever you want, whenever you want, within reason, usually cabined by the maxim that you can't hurt anyone else. This is often referred to as the harm principle, which was articulated by John Stuart Mill in his work on liberty. The harm principle basically says that people should be able to do whatever they want so long as they harm nobody else, and in some cases, themselves. Although with the proliferation of medically assisted dying, it seems that the most liberally minded among us are fully on board with medically assisted dying.
Talking about harm, I'm just gonna go to the outrageous claims that I feel that really need to be pushed back in this video. Like this. Shoe's partner moving from talking about John Stuart Mill's harm principle straight to medically assisted suicide programs that aren't even being done in America. And this is such a superficial reading of the foundational thinkers of liberalism that Locke's perception on something he's going to bring up.
And so basically what John Locke then argues is that this set of rights that existed naturally can never be justly taken away from you, and that if your government is taking them away, you have the right to revolution, okay? No one can take away your natural rights. you're not even allowed to give them up voluntarily. I no longer want to have freedom of speech. And Locke says that's an irrational thing. You can say that, but no, we're not going to let you do that. Okay? And sometimes Lockean liberalism is called natural rights liberalism for exactly this reason. There's a set of natural rights. Governments need to respect them just as much as other individuals need to respect them. There you go.
Thank God he doesn't bring up Locke, the actual strongest core of American values of liberalism that we find in America. Not that I'm thinking he's representing John Stuart Mill here correctly at all either.
Ask someone on the American right, and they'll tell you that you're free so long as the big government socialists aren't telling you what to do. But if BlackRock wants to uproot your life, well, that's actually the epitome of American excellence, sweaty. But in all seriousness...
Oh, he said in all seriousness. So should I assume, he was sort of joking, because it seems like similar points to his nutshell video, but, with less balls to commit to the insane claims he tends to make about liberalism.
Most people think of freedom as the absence of external authority. And to be sure, the absence of external authority is to some extent necessary to be free. However, rooted in the liberal ethos is a rejection not only of external authority, but also the rejection of limits placed on man by virtue of his birth or his biology. Anything that he did not affirmatively, explicitly consent to.
Please, just for once, try to back up some sort of claim with, evidence or actual argument. Seriously, I'm praying that this sort of good old Catholic boy, or at least the person, Lasch, that he's going to go over, can do this at least once in this video.
Now, most people really, don't have the means to escape these limits. But there does exist a certain class of people rebelling against all limitations placed upon their existence. As American historian and social critic Christopher Lasch put it, these people are the elites. And they are, and have been, in open revolt, not only against their uneducated, low-brow, flyover country deplorable countrymen, but also against any and all limitations placed upon them whatsoever. We're going to be talking about both of those revolts today. Christopher Lasch was a 20th century American historian and social critic. He attended Harvard for undergrad, and then earned his PhD from Columbia.
Okay, adding these elites to the mix. Thank God. Along with this Lasch person, blah, 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 bio of Lasch, blah, 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 books of Lasch.
And the true and only heaven, progress and its critics, which we'll also be discussing today. Lasch came from a family of academics. Atheist, socialist academics, to be exact. And he also identified as a socialist during his younger years.
Oh joy, he comes from a commie family. I'm sure this won't influence his worldview in any freaking way.
Lasch adopted some culturally and socially conservative positions, but I'll note here, and many of the more insufferable leftists online will so often remind me, that Lasch rejected the conservative label, at least in the American context. Although he became sympathetic to religion too, he never formally converted or joined a faith tradition as far as I'm aware. So Lasch is seldom, if ever, considered alongside other 20th century American conservatives. But his ideas and works have influenced modern conservative thinkers such as Patrick Deneen, and he's also often favorably cited in the writings found in Compact, which is a fantastic publication, and I recommend you subscribe to them.
This almost seems like Shoe's boy toy is saying that because of him not joining a faith that worshipped a god, that Lasch is being gatekept by certain people into the, heaven that's known as modern conservative thinkers. And there's that name again. Call me skeptical or ye of little faith, eudaimonia here. But why does he think that Lasch should have really, any value to the so-called conservative thinkers of the world, when the only one that he mentions to use this sort of former socialistic ideas of Lasch have moved past the conservative ideas that are already in an area well past liberal ideas that form this sort of nation, who also moved to a, theoretical, liberal theocracy government for America. No, I might be a little bit unfair here. Let's keep listening.
Lasch highlights two primary themes, limits and hope, throughout his work, The True and Only Heaven, Progress and Its Critics. Lasch writes, "Limits and hope. These words sum up the two lines of argument I have tried to weave together.
You or do not. There is no try.
One line of argument seeks to distinguish between hope and optimism, and to explore the implications of that distinction. The other explores some of the political and ideological expressions of the sense of limits. It is their recognition of limits alone that justifies consideration of such great variety of political movements and schools of thought as in any sense part of a single tradition or sensibility. This sensibility, call it populist or petit bourgeois for lack of a better term,
Oh, look, Marx's term, petty bourgeoisie, along with other terms such as explores and justifies consideration or some crap like that.
the idea that history, like science, records a cumulative unfolding of human capacities, and that modern civilization is heir to all the achievements of the past ran counter to common sense, that is, to the experience of loss and defeat that make up so much the texture of daily life. Are there no calamities in history? Orestes Brownson demanded. Nothing tragic? Brownson and other opponents of improvement found little evidence of cumulative enlightenment.
You know what else there is little evidence for? God. Also, again, what is this even trying to say? Please, plain English, and not the Latin that this is coming off as. Yeah, there's a reason the church used that language during Mass for so long. They were the elites before, Martin Luther sort of messed things up, printing press and bringing the Bible to the common man by translating it into a language that they could actually understand. Maybe that's a very simple view of things, but at least that's a small amount of evidence or claims that I'm actually making here that definitely had its, benefits to the common man, or at least taking it out of the elites, in this case, the priest, and putting it into the common man, and gave him a tool for understanding the words that their elites claim to be the word of God.
Lasch suggests that the secular idea of progress represents what was once the Christian belief in providence, as Christianity gave history a clearly defined direction. The Western world thus found it easy to imagine history as a process, generally moving upwards by a series of majestic stages. In time, the theological underpinnings vanished, and a secularized doctrine of unlimited progress began to take form, often rooted in acquisition of material comfort and technical or scientific knowledge.
Spoilers, he doesn't deem to enlighten a more massive mainstream audience of what any of the stuff that he's spouting out here actually even means. Now, I've been to college, but, not really up your own ass level that these people are sort of having to reach for.
Oh, of course. We're a little more progressive and ahead of the curve here in San Francisco. Anyway, I'm sure you'll find it much better here. We're just a little bit more protective.
So my best guess to what this taint level language is trying to say is that enlightenment can't disprove many of the concepts that the church had established that clearly help form the foundations of the Western world. So let me, you dick man, just assume that this is gonna lead to people becoming just like the locusts from the Bible, one of the plagues, who'll just keep consuming and consuming without that wisdom, because there's no moral underpinning to stop humanity from the endless, mindless hunger. Besides that, again, maybe not completely fair, but correct me if I'm wrong, but hasn't philosophy and related ethics ideas have been going along long before the Enlightenment era and existed without the need of a Christian God? Not that I'm discounting a Christian God or Catholic God here. And, well, who am I to throw a monkey wrench into someone else's limited understanding of things, outside the church and their schoolings in these thought processes?
Faith and prophecy made history much more the record of moral failure than a promise of ultimate triumph. Man was not the heir to an earthly paradise, he had squandered that. Rather, man understood himself as fallen, wretched, and undeserving, tethered to Adam, tethered to his past. There does not exist any foreseeable ending in sight under the secular, progressive worldview that came to supersede the aforementioned faith traditions.
Or maybe we're just trying to meet the needs of an ever-growing population. It's not like anyone's homeless or starving in the world still. Frankly, overpopulation seems like a pretty big concern, along with, I don't know, a lot of other fucking issues. Frankly, I think we should work on going to space to colonize other planets. Maybe these, post-liberals wouldn't mind, testing out their ideas on another planet far, far away, along with other space cases out there.
The privately imposed limit, social condemnation of luxury and excess, it slowly gave way to limitless man's limitless appetites. Such developments have eroded and continue to erode other limits and facilitate a sexual liberation in which individuals increasingly value others only inasmuch as they can confer pleasure and gratification. People become products to be consumed and used as one buys a television. Pregnancy, too, became a limit unfairly placed on individuals who simply wanted to consume, to stretch the word to its very limits.
Let me set aside the fact that ShoeOnHead's dork friend here is just, making claims about liberalism without, making any arguments of why any of this is even true, much less provide any evidence that liberalism is really at fault here. So, I'll just assume he's going on blind faith here that any of this stuff is even true. Seems to be matching his MO overall. Now, we get to the real crux of the issue, which sort of baffles me. Because again, overpopulation seems to be, a key factor why it seems like most of the world, not just those living in America, but other countries who don't in fact follow the ideas of liberalism, keep on building more and more, to deal with these sort of issues. And really linking this to the abortion issue is sort of odd in my opinion. Because seriously, in reality, wouldn't that just make things much more worse with the amount we'll have to ramp up production to meet the needs of an ever-growing population if we just get rid of it, outlaw it outright?
This burdensome limit of life has been defeated with the marvels of science and technology. Without any check on rote acquisition, the family farm and business gave way to collectivized agriculture and corporations, which in turn fragmented communities and atomized individuals. I mean, hell, look, we're now manufacturing commodifying romantic partnerships because of how lonely people are.
Again, it's not just overpopulation, I'll give him that, but that is a large contributor that he's really not factoring in here. But, like most critical theories, this one seems to be moving past the actual problems to criticize the effect it has on, his identity. His forsaken tribe, the church, the most sacred institute, family.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
Reduced to merely maintaining the nuclear family, while experts or technocrats are expected to actually rear children. Apprenticeship systems are replaced by schooling and education. Lasch writes that the new breed of capitalists, prioritizing consumption over production, were the real progressives, while working-class individuals sought to preserve a way of life.
Sure, criticize the so-called elites for really not handling any of this properly. But this sort of critical church theory, like many others of its kind, looks at the problems that, it has an effect on a certain identity group is faced with and works backwards to see why their way of life is being affected and changed instead of actually how it is affecting the entire population of the country as a whole. Hey, at least it's not the other identity group on the right, the white supremacists. This is church supremacists, it seems like. Again, not completely fair, but fun to say about, and close enough to the truth that I don't feel any shame in saying that. They're making assumptions based on what their own group's concerns really are. And if this showing from ShoeOnHead's partner, or at least what he's spouting out about those he learning all this post-liberal garbage from, but is it really rooted in reality? And he's not making a convincing argument that it is. Secondhand knowledge and all.
Ultimately, working-class values were supported by an ethic of limits that the elite class had to suppress. These unenlightened working-class individuals had to accept the new order. Lasch begins his essay, The Revolt of the Elites, by first citing Jose Ortega y Gasset's Revolt of the Masses. Ortega contends in his essay that the mass man was, at least at the time of writing, incapable of submitting to direction of any kind, and believed that tomorrow the world will be still richer, ampler, more perfect, as if it enjoyed a spontaneous, inexhaustible power of increase. In short, the mass man, or the common man.
So how did Lasch come to any of these conclusions? I would love some supported evidence how he came to any of these sort of insights that he's sort of spouting out about. But that might be asking for too much. Now, in order to avoid saying the same thing over and over again, I'll just be memeing it every time it, gets too annoying, since it seems era mania is pretty much doing the same thing.
That's a nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
Attributing these characteristics and habits of mind instead to the upper middle and upper classes, the elites, Lasch posits that the mass man very much does accept and sees as necessary the limits placed upon him by virtue of his place of birth and his biology. The elites have come to be the ones who yearn for limitless possibility. One of these limits, or perhaps a collection of them, can be called social relations. The social relations of old, a cultural inheritance and tradition, are viewed by the elites as limits or constraints.
And can you tell me how, any of this relates to liberalism again? Oh yeah.
Citation needed. Citation fucking needed.
Elites cannot understand this because they do not employ the same worldview. They genuinely believe that limits do not exist. They cannot meet what Lasch calls Middle America on its own terms because they speak a different language. Although differences in diction and accent may exist, these classes speak a different moral language and see the world through a radically different lens. The respective worldviews exist not secondary to or as a result of different classes' experience. Rather, these variations serve as the forces that animate the respective classes' different worlds.
Now this is really starting to sound like a critical theory of some type. Is Lasch even trying to say that these so-called liberals are using standpoint theory here? That's what it sounds like. If it does, it doesn't sound like these elites have a lot of liberal values now, doesn't it? Is it even Lasch or Yuda Shupai here making this claim? I guess it doesn't matter, since it completely breaks my brain of how something like standpoint theory is sort of being included into this idea of liberal elites, which he's not directly saying, but he's heavily applied it here, and that's more of a feminist thing that is from a more Marxist perspective. But again, Lasch could be just projecting his own former communist roots onto liberalism from his own personal perspective. Sorry, I like liberalism where things can be discussed and you try to be a little bit honest about your opinions, but honesty will tend to get you messed up. That's probably the biggest weakness of liberalism, hearing people out instead of just shutting them down or memeing on them and making it into a joke with bad facts and arguments. Not that I even want to call any of these those.
Using feminism, or as he calls it, female careerism, as an example, Lasch describes how feminism's purported goal of equality actually only results in equality between men and women of a certain class, while exacerbating and increasing inequality between classes. As attorneys marry attorneys, doctors marry doctors, and support staff marry support staff, the classes become increasingly bifurcated.
The liberal elites are using standpoint theory of feminism. That's really, more a classical Marxist idea, or at least a Marxist rooted version of feminism being instituted here, instead of the more classically liberalistic principles such as equality of people, that all men are created equal. Yeah, I know our foundation wasn't very true to life to that, but it's really besides the point. Liberalism is about practicality, the social contract, and they will push for this when they can at the certain point.
In this system, privileged young people have become problem solvers beyond all else, educated at the best universities, earning advanced degrees. These students are equal to any challenge. The desire to abolish limits has charged the education system to rely on the quantifiable or the data-driven. The problems of today are presented as math problems or science problems. It's no mystery that we see the rise of the social sciences as a series of distinct disciplines with their collective attempts to quantify and rationalize the human experience.
Oh, social sciences are just math problems, you say? Let's see what James Lindsey, with a PhD in mathematics, known for his works on the grievance studies that submitted bogus papers to academic journals on topics in the field of critical social theory, in culture, queer, race, gender, fat, and sexual studies to determine whether or not they would pass through peer review to be accepted for publication. Several of these papers were subsequently published, in which the authors cited in support of their contentions.
You know, you're trying to get me to believe that 2 + 2 isn't 4. I would hear pushback on that. And now they're openly saying 2 + 2 is anything but 4.
That's right. And it's really funny. It's funny, too, because there's a plausible argument that this is my fault. I started making those woke minis to make fun of woke people. And somebody was asking me in my DMs one day, it's like, would they really say that 2 + 2 = 5? And I was like, no, the truth is it's 2 + 2 doesn't matter. It's as long as it's not 4, because 4 is the hegemonic value that's oppressing everybody that came from white Western ways of thinking. So it has to be anything else, but it doesn't matter what the other answers are.
Really hard to say that about, any post-liberalist out there. They seem to be more against the actual liberals and liberalism than they are about, the far left people that they lump in with liberals way too generously and broadly and uncritically, in my personal opinion, and also James Lindsey's opinion and several others.
There's this post-liberal movement on the right that, just like the post-liberal movement we call woke on the left, wants to throw liberalism in the toilet. Now, kind of strangely, many of the people in this movement and tangential to this movement, surrounded by this movement, think that communism is not just an extension of liberalism, but they call the woke left, which are leftists, which are Marxists, which are not liberal, which have been openly criticizing liberalism for a century or more. Openly against it. As far as the woke go, critical race theory was founded to critique the idea of liberal societies and law systems from an angle of race agitation. So they, for some reason, call the people who support this stuff, because they're on the left, liberals, when they're not liberals. We don't have liberals on college campuses. We have leftists. We have Marxists. We have communists. We have so-called democratic socialists who are identical with Marxists. These people are not liberals. They're openly illiberal, openly anti-liberal, just like their counterparts on the right who mistakenly call them liberals. And I think that this is a symptom of a deeper straw-manning, misunderstanding of liberalism.
The desire to quantify and systematize under the modern research ideal that has tightened its stranglehold on modern academia, cataloged by Anthony T. Kronman in his work Education's End. Because universities have now accepted the liturgy of limitlessness, Alan Bloom's claim in The Closing of the American Mind that students arrive at the universities ignorant and cynical about our political heritage.
Oh, look, more names of people and books now. This is how ShoeOnHead's worst half is going to connect this to Lasch's idea of liberal Limitphobia. Or is this just a Gish Gallop overwhelming the audience with names of people being thrown out the ass like a laundry list, instead of actually providing any sort of idea that how any of these unproven theories that are presented uncritically could actually have some semblance of truth to it at all? But truth is more of a liberal idea, so I guess you wouldn't want to take that route. At least, should I say, liberalism is about pursuing the truth and trying to get as close as they can to it, but knowing that there is no truth or something like that. At least that's a more honest representation of liberalism, even if I mangled it rather badly.
The impulse to problem solve, animated by the progressives' Limitphobia, distorts education and thus cripples generations not by changing their minds, but by forcing upon them ideology, the lens through which they see the world. This impulse is reflected in Lasch's view in the rise of symbolic analysts, an elite class composed of problem solvers. These people prioritize implicitly or explicitly abstraction, system thinking, experimentation, collaboration, in the words of Robert Reich.
And here's another name, Robert Reich. I don't like that last name too much. It sounds a little bit too much like Third Reich. Is he even elite? I guess so. That's at least the framing here. But is he a liberal? I'm sure that's what he's assuming here.
Somebody has to clean the elites' homes and serve their mimosas and feed their children, so a class of in-person servers is also sustained. Of course, this class of in-person servers is largely composed of racial and ethnic minorities that cannot speak English, and this cultural and linguistic barrier soothes the elite's conscience to some extent. as their servants occupy different worlds and certainly live on the opposite side of town.
What's up with this non sequitur? I mean, how did we go from something about Reich's idea about the symbolic analysis to this? Seriously, how does anyone take this guy seriously? How far down a rabbit hole or how big are your blinders have to be to actually take this seriously at all?
These unseen laborers tend to view limits and indeed the very existence of limits differently from their social and economic betters. Reich and his ilk believe that the educated technocrats can solve the problems facing society. After all, they're armed with 20th century university education. Lasch quotes William Fulbright, describing this as an arrogance of power.
Sure likes to bring up Reich like it has something to do with the ideas of liberalism when, given his sort of track record, he comes off more as a neoliberal, who, just to be clear, falls far from the liberalism tree, with the likes of Clinton and Obama, who he's worked with, that falls more on the progressive side of things. And I must clarify, progressives have very little to do with actual liberal ideas. But then bring up Lasch's quoting someone else to conflate the two together, I guess.
However, sheer brainpower cannot solve societal problems because societal problems are not mere matters of math, science, or sociology, or any other ology. In other words, there is no answer, just a series of trade-offs sought in the context of inherited wisdom from the past, of culture and tradition.
I'll agree here. The elites are arrogant if they think that all the problems of the world will just be solved in the future by science, just like Shoe's heel here is equally arrogant to think that somehow the wisdom of the past will solve the problems that, would have been considered witchcraft, when that wisdom was initially being formed. Seems like some sort of backwards logic here. I'm not saying either side is right on this case, but...
Lasch writes, a meritocracy has no more need for chivalry and valor than a hereditary aristocracy has for brains. We now have a nobility that lacks nobility. This nobility advances a fiction that its status rests on merit and intelligence alone, endowing it with an ego that allows the elite class to look down upon the rabble of society, while also seeing itself as the rabble's salvation.
Hold on here. Who here is really advancing a fiction?
That's a nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
The one example of an actual liberal brought up in this whole video, and he doesn't even really seem to follow the ideas of liberalism, and the rest is assertions, vague generalizations, and a whole bunch of theories critical of liberalism by people I'm not even sure are even smart enough to know what liberalism is, much less what are some of the problems with liberalism really are. Because trust me, there are quite a few of them in my general opinion and other legitimate critics of liberalism, but this video isn't making a decent argument that it is Limitphobia.
Elite children attend private school, elites have private insurance, they hire private security. They hire professional services instead of relying upon community. For example, the professional tutor is employed instead of the bilingual neighbor, the lawn care company instead of the neighbor's son. Why borrow a neighbor's ladder when Amazon has 2-day shipping? The elites have abdicated their national identity, they're tethering to place, time, or community. This leads to a decline of nationhood traditionally understood. The middle and working class citizens can counter with a sense of place, respect for historical continuity, necessary for societal flourishing, but only for so long. In The Fragility of Liberalism, Lasch explains that the progressive has attempted to remove himself from history, as his ideal higher education system no longer emphasizes Western history, literature, or philosophy, another attempt at untethering and escaping the unconsented to limit that is the past. We have, under this progressive aim, divorced ourselves from our cultural inheritance because we don't want to be reminded that we even have one.
Oh, here it is. Again, being an idiot and thinking that progressive are liberals. I'll come back if he actually gets into something that does have something to do with enlightening era liberal ideas.
The American right suggests that we must increase the general pool of goods and services.
Okay, my bad. But seriously, why is Bernie Sanders up there when ShoeOnHeads is talking about the American right? seems a little bit weird, but yeah, he's still not talking about liberalism.
Now, however, we see the fruits of subordinating the family to the school. Our elected leaders tell us now that all children are our children, which is a nice way of saying the state's children. Instead of just taking the smart ones and shipping them off to indistinguishable cities, now they're openly bragging about owning them in elementary school. In the past, liberals could afford a broad definition of free speech only because they could take for granted the existence of informal sanctions against its misuse.
And you date man AI doesn't have enough RAM or processing power to understand liberalism again, or maybe it's Lasch.
Man's natural state is to strive to be as he ought. Man will never achieve that goal in this life, for the true and only heaven exists in the world to come. However, that does not reduce the project to a fool's errand. Liberalism's understanding of man has made him into a beast in the name of abolishing all limits imposed upon him by culture, inheritance, tradition, and God.
You figure them combined would actually make a coherent argument, but, couldn't be too hard on last year since it's being spouted by this hang-me-on.
In so doing, it's imposed the greatest limit of them all, endowing man with a bestial nature, sentencing him to enslavement, to his passions, and depriving him of his inheritance. When man was expelled from the Garden of Eden, he did not come to inhabit Hobbes' state of nature. This is the lie that has been advanced by liberalism. It distorts man's tethering to Adam, understanding it as a condemnation of man and granting license to behave as beasts, because that is all man is anyways.
Yeah, bring up Hobbes' state of nature like he really thinks that it's a good thing to have. And sure, neglect to bring up what he follows these ideas or theories up on. At least I think, I should give him some credit here for bringing up someone who could actually be considered one of the foundational thinkers that, came up with many of the theories that later became liberalism back in the 17th century, of course. At least ShoeOnHead's achy breaky mate didn't go for John Locke's blank slate theory that, most people go for. That sort of connects to liberalism and progressivism. What they never really bring up is that by its very design, liberalism is meant to check itself through discussions with itself on these particular theories, because that's what they are. Theories to sort of summarize how people think, not hardline rules like other philosophies tend to broadly follow. And given all this was really pre-liberalism, and these post-liberalists, like this douche here, would probably acknowledge that most liberals, actual liberals, would be up for the state of nature versus nurture discussion. And frankly, even Locke would probably agree that there's an argument to be made for both, and the truth probably lies somewhere in between. Wait, no, sorry. I sort of doubt this man making this video that I'm responding to would acknowledge any of that. Seriously, a large majority of this video comes off as a lie. No matter if it's a fundamental misunderstanding because of, some critical theory of the right side of academia, in order to combat the critical theories of the more progressive, not liberal colleges and their sort of identity process. As I said, critical church theory is what it comes off, or maybe this is just dishonesty here. You never know with this sort of weird shit out there, but it isn't good argumentation and really isn't good logic overall. Still, the only thing I can get from Leech on Shoe is whatever form of post-liberalism he's pushing is post-honesty and post-intellectualism. With that said, I'm done.